Hey everybody, JMac here in another Refactor Friday video. I tried to live stream, but unfortunately I ran into some issues with Ecamm Live. It's the software I use to broadcast, which is normally pretty good, but I fell into the often developer trap there where it asked me to upgrade right before I wanted to go live, and I did, and apparently they have some kind of bug where it's not interacting with the YouTube um, live stream API correctly. There must have been some kind of change, but it was complaining about some kind of filter. Looked like it was a option in the API, maybe they missed or something. So I tried to stream through I think it was like Restream.io or Restreamer.io, which was working, but the quality was super low. I'm not sure if it was because it was forwarding the broadcast or my machine or what, but I'm just going to record something here locally. I'd rather have better video quality as much as I want the interaction with viewers. Um, video quality, audio quality just trumps everything. So let's get started kind of where I left off last week. So I was working on this increase-decrease plan, and I kind of moved ahead with it without the tests, but I want to go back and focus on the tests. And so kind of the main issue here was I left these as a warning to kind of make sure that I came back to revisit them. So actually this one is from something else, but these two are kind of where, again, I had left those tests in a place where they were incomplete. I kind of tested as much as I could, but I took out the tests. And now it's just throwing a warning because there's nothing there. So let's open up PHP Storm and kind of take a look at where I left off. So let me get a little drink here. Voice is a little cracky. So let's start with this plan quantity controller because this is kind of going to be an easy way in. So the main issue here was that basically, it was this increment quantity, and this is actually a cashier method for Laravel Cashier. It's what I use to manage the subscriptions. Excellent open source add-on for Laravel projects. Makes it super easy to interact with Stripe, I believe Braintree, and there's some other add-ons from the community as well. But I was already using Stripe, so this was kind of a no-brainer for me to just pull up Cashier. But the thing with Cashier is that it's not super easy to fake. I dug around in the core. There's no really way to kind of swap out that piece inside of Cashier. So kind of like Laravel makes it really easy to swap out other facades. There's actually like a swap method, which we're going to see here in a minute. But Cashier didn't have one of those. It's using the subscription object directly. And we could do several different things to kind of make sure this works. We could kind of have some kind of helper method to get a subscription that would maybe return something, and then there we could kind of stub that out to make sure it's calling, increment quantity or these other types of things. So there's a lot of different things that we could do to kind of abstract that ability to get a I guess like the subscription. So we could have like a hook to get into it. So there's a couple different approaches. So let me just kind of spike this out so you get the idea. And these are kind of the two things that I thought about, and I think we're going to end up choosing one of these. So one of them is kind of a provider pattern, let's call it, or approach maybe is better. I don't want to confuse this with kind of technical terminology here. So we could use like this provider approach, and basically what we could do here is we could say something like um, there's a like subscription provider, and we basically pass it a get, a real simple like static get method, and it would basically for whatever user, or in this case the request user, and then get us like the shifty plan, and this would effectively return a subscription. And what we could do then is this would effectively be some kind of facade, potentially. And as such, we could easily swap it out and therefore control its response. And at that point, we would make sure that, we then called increment quantity on something that we were able to mock out. So this is an approach that we could use here. I thought about this one. I'm not too sure how well that's going to work in other areas. So for example, down here we do decrement quantity, but then we also do other things with the subscription itself, like access its quantity, and just some different things. Because at the end of the day, the subscription is actually a model underneath the covers. So just to kind of demonstrate that, let me just bring up the subscription. So even though this extends cashier, a cashier subscription, it's still a model at the end of the day, and it has some other things that I can hook into it that I'm using in the application. So if I did this, I'm going to end up mocking a lot more, in my opinion. Even though we don't see that here in just this one place, we can definitely see that down here where subscription quantity is used, the subscription ID, the user ID of the subscriptions used, a lot of linkage on the models actually taking place. So this provider pattern probably wouldn't work out so well. So let me just back this up here for a second. And so the other one I thought of was maybe like a helper approach. And so for some of these difficult methods that we know actually interact with Stripe, we could actually use this helper to kind of facilitate that. So it basically becomes like a wrapper or an adapter or something. It's just a real thin layer that ultimately just delegates down to Stripe. But it gives us a little bit of a layer that makes it easy to test, and kind of like I talked about last time, and in the words of JB Rainsberger, J Brains, that we push these kind of things to the boundary. So we push it out somewhere really far out of the application, not in the core, not in like the controller, the models, or whatever. We're not doing these like API calls here. We push it to this layer or this class, or in this case, this helper that's right on the edge of the application. And because it's at the boundary, we don't have to test it very heavily. So it's a real similar look. It just kind of inverts some of those responsibilities. So instead of asking for a provider to give us back a subscriber, we would actually tell a facade to use a subscription and then do something with it. So in this case, we would say something like, let's just call it subscription helper for now. And we would say something like increment, quantity, or like plan quantity or something. And we could be a little domain specific because, again, these methods talk about, I guess, what we're using are the subscriptions for. And we would actually pass it a subscription. And from then on, let's just actually var this off so we can kind of see what that looks like. So we have the subscription. Let's pull that just a bit higher. And this approach would effectively take the place of this increment quantity line. And the helper would actually just call that. This approach is kind of nice for two reasons. One, even though it kind of adds this wrapping layer, which is a little bit annoying, hopefully we're only going to need to wrap a handful of functions. We're not going to wrap the entire cashier API or all of its methods, for example. Two, this helper could easily be a Laravel facade, which gives us the ability to swap it out with something very easily, so we can call it statically and so forth. And then also, because we're passing in the subscription, now when we go to test this, at the boundary, even then we wouldn't necessarily have to do a API call or a full true integration test. We could just pass in a mock subscription and verify that it called the right cashier methods. And we'll talk about this more, I think, maybe in a minute, but I kind of like that because then everything's a really almost more of a unit test, if you will. It's going to be a faster test is ultimately what I'm getting at. So I think ultimately I like this helper approach. Even though this name is this name's pretty lame, it's something that can be easily cleaned up later once, we make a few of these methods. So I think this is the approach I want to take. So let's go ahead and start test driving this out. So I'm going to comment this back out, and I'll kind of just leave the rest here. And let's open up our plan controller test. And I'm going to bring this off to the side. And so we basically have this increments plan quantity. And this test is pretty much already written at this point. So what we can do is we can basically just turn this back into a test, and we'll say something like at test, and now we should be in a place where we're running. Whoops, not pstorm. Let's bring up. Okay, so we have a failure. Let's get to where we're just running that one test, and we'll kind of go from there. So vendor bin php unit, boom. Okay, we have a failure. Failed asserting that 2 is identical to 3. So this is actually pretty nice, even though it's kind of a low-level test. The point here is that it basically didn't increment the quantity. And that's going to be legitimate, right? Because we're not actually calling increment quantity. And just for those that maybe didn't see the previous video, let's just throw this back in here, this increment quantity. I think it was the cashier. Quantity. There we go. I think I can spell today, maybe. And we have an error. And there we go. Could not determine which URL represents the customer. And this is a really low-level subscription cashier, error. And it's because, again, underneath the covers, this is actually trying to use a real cashier, make the calls to Stripe. And so without a user that has a valid customer ID in the Stripe test API in my test, platform or test environment for Stripe, that, it's just not going to work. And that would require a lot of setup. Not only would I have to make a customer, but then I would have to subscribe them. I have to use, fake credit cards for tokens and all sorts of things to kind of make this actually work. So that's why we're going to kind of inject this helper pattern here or this approach to kind of push that out to the boundary. So let's kind of start mocking this out and changing our test. So because of that, we're not actually going to be able to test the real thing. We're not going to be able to say, like, it updated the quantity. What we're going to need to do instead is leverage the subscription helper and make sure that it called the right method with the right thing. And so that's pretty much what we're going to end up doing. So let me pull this out, and let's kind of write the test that we want. And so the assertion here would basically be like the subscription helper, and we would want to ultimately kind of swap it out. And what we're going to need to do is actually make this thing, and it's going to make life a little bit easier here. So I'll keep spiking just for a bit longer, but let's just call this helper, and we'll call this mockery. Whoops. Mockery mock, and we'll say something like helper expects a call to increment quantity, or we'll just keep this planned quantity just to differentiate. Quantity. I don't know why I can't spell that this morning. So increment, there we go, increment quantity with basically the subscription that we used up here, right? That's what it's going to ultimately pass in. And then, let's see here, it's not going to need to return anything. So, and then we would ultimately want to swap our helper out with the real thing. So we can move this up because this is all part of our kind of arrangement, if you will, all the pre-setup to make sure this works correctly. So we don't have this, so this needs to be a string, first of all. And now when we run this, we should get a pretty nasty error. It doesn't know what subscription helper is. So let's go ahead and make this. So I'm going to make this over here. Let's go to the app folder. I don't think I have any facades in here. I think I throw everything under services until I kind of reach a critical mass. So I'm going to continue down that road just because I don't want to make a facade folder just yet. So let's just call this subscription helper. And this is going to be a facade. And so we can just say class subscription helper extends facade. And this is going to be a support facade. And let's bring this in. All right, and we also should namespace this. So this is going to be app services. There we go. And there's our facade. And there'll need to be some setup that we have to do here to kind of like leverage the real thing. What's interesting here is that this isn't actually a facade. It's not calling something under the covers per se. Although it could call, we could get a little fancy here and make this thing call uh, Cashier directly unless I swap it out. So it could just be a complete facade for Cashier. That's interesting. Kind of interesting. That would take a lot of overriding. I may explore that in a future thing. I would just want to make this as simple as possible today. So really what this needs to be is it needs to return a facade accessor. So let's do this. Laravel facade. Uh, they have a way to write your own. I think they even have like implicit or real-time facades. Let's see what this does. Publisher, update. Okay, using real-time facades, you can treat any class in your application as if it were a facade. To illustrate how this is used, let's examine. Okay, so they have this publish method. We can say facades app contracts publisher, and we'll say publisher publish, and it knows to call this method. That's interesting. I wonder if it has the swappability though, of like being able to swap it out during testing. That would be kind of interesting. So how does this work? When real-time facade, the publisher implementation will be resolved out of the service container using the portion of the interface or class name. When testing, we can use Laravel's built-in facade testing helpers to mock this method call. So we say publisher should receive once with podcast. So it seems like you can just do this right out of the box. Let's try this for a second. This is interesting. So let's have the subscription helper not extend facade. All right. And we will make a public function increment quantity. Or well, you know what? We don't even need to do that because we're testing. So let's try this out. Let's import this class, but it has to be a facade. Now this contract thing's a little confusing to me. Publisher, publisher. So where's the actual implementation of publish? Okay, let's see here. Update publishing. So we have this publish method, this update publishing now, publisher publish. Injecting a publisher implementation allows us to easily test this method in isolation since we can mock the injected publisher. However, it requires us to always pass the instance, explicitly pass to generate a real-time facade prefix the namespace of the imported class with facades. So this just uses a contract. So let's try this. Crazy. All right. And we're going to do the same thing down here. And supposedly we can just do should receive. But theoretically, that should also allow us to be swapped. So let's just kind of see what explodes here. Okay, so app controllers not found. Okay, so it actually didn't complain about the test. That's interesting. So let's import this class and throw facades in front of it. And let's see where we get. No matching handler found for app model subscription, either the method. Okay. Huh. That seems to kind of just magically have worked. Let's drop this requirement here. Holy crap. That's pretty impressive. So that works. So let's recap here because that was a little struggle city here. So we made this subscription helper and we turned it into a facade using this real-time facade pattern, which is nice because then I don't have to make the subscription facade, which calls the helper and all that binding. We can kind of just leverage it here with this custom namespace. It's a little bit annoying, I think, for PHP Storm. It doesn't really know what that is, but I'm sure there's a way to probably fix that. With that, we're also able to swap. And it seems like we possibly could have done just should have received kind of thing here on that. But I kind of like the swap just in case we want to be a little more explicit with certain things. So basically we made our own mock, we set up an expectation for it, and then we swap it out using the underlying facade swap. There's one more thing I want to do here. I always forget to do this, and this bit me the other day. I need to do Mockeries teardown methods. So let me bring this up. Mockery teardown. They're pretty specific in the fact that you want to do this mockery close here. So let's just do that. What's wrong with you, teardown? Let's make it protected. And then what's wrong with this? Return to, oh, this has to return void, I think. Right, there we go. All right, cool. So let's do that, and let's also call parent teardown to do the right thing. Okay, cool. So without this mockery close bit, I've had situations where, because that expect actually is something that potentially gets checked a little later in the life cycle, my tests weren't failing correctly. So not an issue here, but I've tried to be good about making sure to put that in there and be thorough. And in fact, it's possible that the base test case already does this. So let's just check that real quick. Yeah, here's a teardown. So they don't seem to call it. Oh, there we go. They are calling mockery close already. So actually, Laravel is already taking care of that for us. So cool. Okay, so that was good. Good to know. All right, so let's get back to what we want to test. So we have the subscription helper. We don't even have this method here, but we do want to be a little more explicit that we got this subscription back. So what we could do is, I think you can wrap this in a closure. So mockery closure argument. I think there's a way, yeah, here we go. There's a way to say, it doesn't have to be identical to, not equal to, not a type of. We want it to be just a bit stronger than that. So there's this mockery on, and it looks like it'd be nice if you could just say, like, here's the expression to use, but that's probably too tight of a closure. So let's pick this up by saying, so the argument here is going to be the subscription, and we are going to want to use our subscription. And so we'll basically just say return the subscription IDs are the same. So argument ID is equal to subscription ID. Let's try that. Cool, and we're still passing. So that basically, that takes care of that, I think. So we're able to pull this out. And so what we've done here is we've made this subscription helper. It's not even real just yet, but we've used a real-time facade with Laravel to basically allow us to call a increment plan quantity method statically and pass it the subscription. So in our test, we've done a little bit of setup to basically say, hey, mock out this subscription helper and make sure that when we call increment plan quantity, that the argument that was passed, meaning this subscription, is equal to these IDs. So that the IDs are equal, because the subscription itself is not going to match, because since this is a little bit of a functional test, it's actually pulling it out of the database based on this request user. So again, I didn't want to mock out all of the models and so forth. That would end up being a very, very unit test, like a unit testy type of test. So that's just something that I think would have been a little bit nastier. So what I want to do here then is, let's go ahead and abstract this because it's something that we're going to use multiple times. So I just want to go ahead and kind of set this up in our setup. So let's do that. Let's do a setup, and we'll get that going, and we'll call parent setup. Again, don't want to forget that parent setup. I've done that a few times. And let's abstract this into a helper, or sorry, a private field, and we can call this helper, I guess. And let's pull this and this up here just to make life a little cleaner. All right, so we're going to set that up there because we're going to end up using that in the other bit too. We're still passing, all good. Okay, cool. So let's review this one last time. We can get rid of this with handling now that we've gotten through the woods of testing that out. We set up a user, we set up a subscription, we assert that the helper is going to be called with increment plan quantity, and then it's basically going to be passed its argument of the subscription that we had set up with our factory. We're going to actually make the response, and then we're going to assert that we got redirected to the Shifty plan page, and that our that our session now holds a plan quantities key with a value of increased. So basically, this is all handled with the factory model. This is our new facade that allows us to stand in front of Cashier, so we're not actually making calls, and then the rest is all just Laravel's HTTP tests. So pretty straightforward. A little bit of setup here with this mockery bit, but again, there might be a fancier way to assert that that argument had this particular key and don't have to do this kind of with closure. But it does work. Now we can continue repeating this pattern. So when we got down here for decrementing the quantity, again, we would just stand in front of this by saying, subscription helper, decrement plan, or decrement plan quantity, and of course we would just pass it the subscription. And I could drive the test out for that. I think you get the idea. It would basically just be the same thing. We just swap this out. We make sure we're sending at the right bit. So that's all set up, and the rest of this should be tested. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on from that. I want to focus on actually driving this out now to demonstrate how we can continue to push this kind of from, again, a faster or unit test type approach. So what I want to do is let's go to the tests folder, unit tests. We already have some service tests here. That's good. Let's make a new PHP test, PHP unit test. And what we're going to test is app services, can't type this morning, subscription helper. There we go. And it's going to generate everything for us. Thank you, PHP Storm. And it even puts it over here. Nice. Although the template's old because it's still using this PHP unit framework test case, which is not exactly what I'm after. So let's fix that real quick. And we'll import that so it's a little cleaner. And let's start driving this out. So we know we have this increment plan quantity and this decrement plan quantity. Let's make sure they do the right thing. So let's just do something here pretty simple. Because this is a unit test, I'm going to go back to the unit style testing. So I'm just going to say public function test increment plan quantity. And hopefully I spelled all that correctly. And so basically what we're going to do here is we're going to new up one of these guys. I'm just going to call this subject, and we'll refactor this test here in a minute, but let's just keep driving. So let's do a new subscription helper. It gets nothing. We basically now want to create a subscription mock. And so we'll just bring in mockery again. We'll make a mock. And in this case, it's not going to be any type of mock. We're not setting that up in any kind of way. We could do some type hinting, and we'll toy with that maybe in the decrement just for an example. So we made this mock, and we basically say subject expects, and it's going to expect, increment quantity, because that is the underlying cashier bit. So it's going to expect increment quantity. It doesn't need to do anything else. And at that point, we basically can actually do the thing. So in this case, increment plan quantity. There we go. And that's really our test because it's not going to return anything or do anything else. So that's it. So let's go ahead and set this up. So what we're going to do here is this is a unit test. So this will be test unit services, excuse me, and then subscription helper test. And we get a failure. Increment plan quantity does not exist on this mock object. That makes sense. So let's go ahead and Well, wait a second, that's not right. Mockery mock increment plan quantity. Did I do the wrong thing? Yes, I did do the wrong thing. That's the incorrect test. So definitely want to slow down when you get these errors. Make sure you're getting the right thing. Otherwise, you're potentially not driving these correctly. So this, even though it was somewhat of an expected error message, it wasn't the exact message because I shouldn't have been calling this directly on a mock object. This is the more appropriate error, which I expected is an undefined method. So let's go ahead and take care of that. So let's add that method. Added. Looks like I spelled increment quantity again. So now we have a risky test. We didn't perform any assertions. So what's wrong here? Increment. Still having trouble spelling today. Look at that. Increment. There we go. Thank you, PHP Storm. And now we have a risky test. We didn't perform any assertions. And I think this goes back to the whole mockery bit. So let's mockery teardown. Let's get that back up because this is a PHP unit test, which is not going to have that teardown method that I wanted. So let's just bring that back in. And this extends that, so that should be good. There we go. Okay, so now we're actually getting an error. Method increment quantity, any argument from mockery should be called exactly 1 times, but called nothing. So let's make this a little tighter because it talked about no or any arguments. So let's do with no args just to tighten that up a bit because we should never call increment quantity with anything. So now method increment quantity, no arguments, should be called exactly 1 times, but called 0. So let's take that subscription at this point and let's call subscription increment quantity. And too few args. What's wrong with you? Increment quantity. Cool. And so now the issue is we actually didn't test drive that piece. We're not passing in our subscription correctly. So let's do that. Subscription. And there we go. We still have this risky test because we didn't perform any assertions. These are strict assertions as far as PHP unit is concerned. So that's a little bit annoying. Let's see here. I wonder if you can say something like subscription should have received increment. Let's just swap this around a little bit. Let's see what this kind of does. So we still have a risky test. We didn't get any failures. Let's pull this out. Now we get an issue where it's a mock. We'd have to make it a spy. That's a bit annoying. So it's kind of funny with this lightweight test because we're not really. It goes to show that this is kind of just a little bit silly in the fact that this is all so lightweight, this wrapper. Like these tests are just kind of dumb. There's like this risky test. We could do all sorts of things to like make sure this returned null. We could get fancy and like have this return the subscription so you could chain things on it. So we could do something like that. But that all seems a bit lame just to kind of appease PHP unit as far as this risky test. Because we did perform an assertion as far as the fact that this mockery object behaved correctly. But I don't want to see this R test all the time. So I'm wondering what could happen here to make this, just a little bit happier. We could just do something like, just to make it happy, assert null, that it returned nothing. It's a bit silly again, so kind of lame. Let's just do that though for now to keep it working. And let's do a few more things. Let's go ahead and make subject a property. So let's call it subject. And subject is fine. And let's go ahead and set up our setup method. And in here we'll call setup just as we did before. And let's go ahead and steal this line. Make that a little tighter. And from then on, that'll be okay. And we're going to be doing different things with subscription each time. So let's leave that alone for the moment. And let's go ahead and drive out the one other method that we are going to be using. And this time we'll maybe test it with some type hints just to kind of see what that feels like. So increment plan, or this will be decrement, I'm sorry. Decrement plan quantity. And now at this point, let's go ahead and kind of do basically the same thing. So I'm just going to copy this in the interest of time, and let's change in to dec, and that should be good. And we'll go ahead and generate this method just to get past that silly little warning. Oh, it doesn't know what subject is now, so let's go ahead and type in this just for giggles. So this will be a subscription helper. And now we should be able to add that method. There we go, cool. And it's doing some fancy type hints there where it doesn't need to. So let's run this again. We get an error. We expect decrement quantity to be called, but it was never called. So we can just pop this over here and change this to decrement, and we're all good. So again, this is just a super tiny wrapper for Cashier. We could push the envelope just slightly here with some type hints. So we could say something like, this has to be a subscription model. Now that's a little bit hit or miss. And what I mean by that is, it's not, this really doesn't expect a subscription model directly. Like, even though decrement quantity would live on that, what this really expects is a cashier subscription. That's what it's ultimately going to be after. So if we look at our Laravel Cashier subscription, we could change this import to be Laravel's Cashier subscription. And now we know that, this is a wrapper specifically for Cashier. So part of me likes this type hint because it demonstrates that coupling, but that's going to be a little bit annoying from our tests because now we have to make sure that we're an instance of that. And let's see if we can quickly get by that issue. So let's make this a subscription class. So I'm going to change this mock to be a mock of that class, and let's see if this plays on. And it does. And so since that was a pretty easy setup, in my opinion, it also gives us that binding. It kind of documents that in a way. I am going to keep these type hints. So I am going to pull this out and change this to be a subscription as well. Whoops, subscription. And let's borrow this mockery class line. And in fact, let's just go ahead and put this up in subject because we're going to be using this a bunch. So let's change this to a subscription, and we'll call it subscription. And we'll basically say, let's take this up top here. We'll set it up with that and leave that alone. We don't need that anymore, and this can change to this subscription. And let's make sure we're all still passing. Oops, missing a variable for subscription. That autocomplete didn't fix there. There we go, good. So we're back to green. So let's just recap here, and then we'll stop there for the day. So the goal here was starting kind of at the highest level, going all the way back. The goal here was basically to get rid of the situation where we were calling this subscription increment quantity directly. And the reason, of course, we didn't want to do that is because that was actually making Stripe API calls. And there didn't seem to be a way out of the box with Cashier to kind of fake or limit its, usage for that. And I dug pretty deep into Cashier, and it's pretty woven tightly. Some of the very first requests that it makes are to go get the customer from Stripe. And then from there, it kind of does all the model stuff later on. Now, there might be a way to abstract that and make that a little more testable. That's maybe a PR I might look into in the future. I also saw online people were doing things where they were just swapping out the entire Cashier kind of model layer and kind of stubbing out all of those methods. As we saw before, that's pretty heavy. Like, now we have to do a lot more mocking. In my opinion, we're already doing a lot of mocking that I wish we didn't have to do. But that would have been way more. So what we chose to do was kind of just inject this little helper pattern. And we leveraged a facade to do that here with Laravel because Laravel makes it super easy. In fact, easier than I thought because we can use this real-time facade to kind of hook in this subscription helper. And now we can just wrap the methods that are difficult to test. And this is that whole JB Rainsberger pushing things to the boundary. So if it's super difficult to test this thing and it would require a lot of integration style setup, like physical setup, meaning I have to create a customer in my Stripe test mode, I have to make sure it's there, I have to make sure they have a subscription, I have to make sure they can increment the plan. I mean, there's so many steps to set that up. I don't want to do that here for all these controller lower level tests, in my opinion. Here, what I really want to test is that you called cashier correctly, or you called something correctly to increment the plan, and you kind of managed the rest of the application business logic, meaning the flash messages, the redirections, and so forth. I don't really care to test cashier because cashier is a third-party package. I trust that it's there. Some people feel different about that, especially if it's a mission critical piece of the application, which this is. I might want to test maybe that integration all the way through, right? But in this case, I'm comfortable just deferring that to a helper, kind of using this facade to make it easy to test here, and then driving out the coupling that actually does exist between this helper and the real concrete thing underneath, which is the subscription. And because I'm passing in the subscription, I'm actually kind of inverting that control or inverting that responsibility to use more of a delegate pattern here. So even though it's a little bit clumsy at the higher level to say, hey, subscription helper, increment the quantity for this subscription, that rolls off the tongue nicely, but it's a little bit odd, right? You would normally just think you would call the method increment directly as we do here. But again, that inversion allows us to make this a super easy test down here. And we can test that we're calling those true cashier methods directly. The type hint just gives us, in my opinion, a little bit of extra security, or really more importantly, the documentation of what the expectation is to be passed in here. You can't just pass in any old subscription object that has an increment quantity. We actually want to tie it to cashier because that's what we're using in the Shift application. So hopefully this was helpful. Again, got stuck on it last week, even got stuck a little bit today, but some cool things in here actually with that real-time facade. That was kind of new, something I hadn't used before. And again, this kind of inversion by leveraging that facade made it not only super easy to test by just kind of using that whole swap that's built into all the Laravel facades, the swap method, but also, just being able to test with a one-line little mock expectation that we called this increment plan quantity. And there's a couple other methods I need to drive out. I think there's, I have this like swap plans kind of thing. That's going to be another method I have to drive out. So there's a little more to do from the last video just for completeness, but I'll kind of leave that up to you as an exercise to kind of see what you'd want to do there. So hopefully you found this helpful. Feel free to leave me some comments on the YouTube video or on Twitter for anything you might have done differently or any suggestions you have. And hopefully I'll see you all next Friday live. So, see you.